The Walt Disney Company is a mess, and the largesse of that blame must be laid at the feet of current and former CEO Robert Iger. But there was a time when they had another CEO not that long ago, Bob Chapek. And wouldn't you know it, Alex Sherman at CNBC News has managed to confirm nearly everything, if not every point, that I've ever discussed here on Valiant Renegade about the war at Disney between these two. Bob Iger was relentless, never wanting to relinquish control of Disney, even after stepping down. And this article goes into an amazing amount of detail about how that all went down. Bob Chapek confided to a friend that his tenure at Disney was, quote, about 3 years of hell. Don't be fooled. Bob Iger was absolutely talking to senior and junior executives at Burbank in Disney, undermining Bob Chapek from the beginning from within, all because Bob Chapek committed the sin of not bowing at the altar of Bob Iger.
Renegade Online.
Well, folks, welcome back. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's good to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many folks watching this video, not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment and turn that little red subscribe button to gray. Hit that like button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias, and of course, please do leave a comment before you head out the door today. This is a 12,000-word article from Alex Sherman and CNBC, Disney's wildest ride, Iger, Chapek, and the making of an epic succession mess. As I mentioned in the intro, going on to confirm nearly everything that we've ever told you here on Valiant Renegade regarding the relationship between Bob Iger and Bob Chapek and the complete mess that it made. Iger's meddling from the get-go and the damage that he has personally done to the Walt Disney Company, and quite frankly, the fact that I don't believe that anybody at the Walt Disney Company currently can save it. Now, we're going to go through most of the high points in this article today, but please make sure you set your notifications for the Sunday live show here on Valiant Renegade that we do every week at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to cover this article in far more depth with our panel of guests and experts. You've probably heard me talk many times about the fact that even after Iger retired, quote-unquote, from the Walt Disney Company, that he refused to leave even his own executive suite. And the first part of this article addresses exactly that. As part of the changing the guard, the Disney board suggested the new CEO, that would be Bob Chapek, should take over Iger's expansive office at Disney's headquarters in Burbank, California. There was, however, just one problem. Iger had no interest in moving out. He wasn't truly leaving Disney anyway. His succession plan allowed him to stay on as executive chairman of the board for an additional 22 months. Chapek would still report to him and the board. Iger would also, quote, direct the company's creative endeavors. Nebulous phrasing suggesting he would retain control of movie and TV content operations. Let's pause right there. What have I been saying now for the longest time here on this channel? That is that you can't put the blame at the feet of Bob Chapek for a lot of the failures of things like Star Wars and, quite frankly, even Marvel well into phases 4 and 5. Those projects were planned, greenlit, and overseen by Robert Iger, even after he retired as CEO. His power as executive chairman, now confirmed by CNBC and their interview of some nearly 24 sources from the Walt Disney Company at the senior executive level, who, of course, preferred to remain unnamed, I wonder why, telling us that, in fact, this was true, that Bob Iger was the one that still had the creative control at Disney. You have to wonder what the hell Bob Chapek even had power over. The next few paragraphs pretty much tell us why Iger didn't want to leave his office. He was too busy schmoozing it up in Hollywood with all of his big celebrity friends. That's what he was doing after all, still running the creative side of the company. Meanwhile, Bob Chapek, the more down-to-earth Midwestern businessman, as the article states, preferred sitting around looking at numbers and spreadsheets. Whereas Iger holds court around his Brentwood mansion, a short stroll from celebrities, producers, super agents, and other Disney executives, Chapek lives about an hour's drive from downtown Los Angeles in Westlake Village. Iger enjoys yachting. Chapek is more of a powerboating and kayaking kind of guy. Are you starting to get the picture? Yeah, people keep wondering why Disney feels so detached from Middle America and why their margins on films and television have just gone to pot. Well, look no further than those paragraphs in that CNBC article. While Bob Iger is partying with the Hollywood types on his yacht, Bob Chapek's out there fishing on his kayak. On the wall of Iger's bathroom, the one that he failed to relinquish to Chapek, hung two posters. The first was a framed collage of newspaper front pages and magazine covers with images of Iger celebrating Disney's purchase of Marvel in 2009. The second picture spoofed the movie poster for the 1975 Clint Eastwood thriller, The Iger Sanction, but the image was of Iger instead of Eastwood with the title The Iger Sanction. Can you smell the narcissism yet? Now, if you don't know, The Iger Sanction is about an assassin who comes out of retirement for one last job. You could not make this crap up. Of course, on November 20th of 2022, Bob Iger came out of retirement to become Disney's CEO once again. The board had fired Bob Chapek within days. Iger fired Chapek's closest advisors, including his former chief of staff, Arthur Bachner, his assistant, Jackie Hart, his de facto second-in-command, Kareem Daniel. In July, Iger extended his contract through 2026, the fifth time he has pushed back his departure as CEO. Now, here's where the article fails to mention a few key facts. Namely, was that when Iger retired earlier that year, or at least January 1st of that year in 2022, the first time as the executive chairman of the board, finally giving Bob Chapek breathing room, as it were. Only 11 months of breathing room, as it turned out. But that being the case, Bob Iger still managed to retain a 5-year advisory contract with the Walt Disney Company after he left the board and the CEO position, meaning that Bob Iger was still hanging around, looming behind the scenes, working against Bob Chapek, as this article will display. And guess what? When Bob Iger leaves again in 2026, or at least so we think he will, that whole 5 years is renewed, meaning that Bob Iger isn't actually leaving the Walt Disney Company until 2031. Bob Chapek confided to a friend that his tenure at Disney was, quote, about 3 years of hell, defined by one overriding theme, that Bob Iger would come back again. Sound familiar? It should. That's the same thing that people like former Marvel chairman Ike Perlmutter were saying, along with Nelson Peltz of Trian, who made a play to get on the board after becoming an activist investor last year, as per SEC filings made public by the Walt Disney Company. Seems like everybody that was there trying to run the ship at that point was afraid of Bob Iger coming back and mucking up the works again. Bob Iger, meanwhile, told his peers and colleagues he returned to Disney to correct what he sees as one of the biggest mistakes of his career, choosing Bob Chapek. Seriously, I think there's some traffic somewhere he could go play in. Quote, when the two people at the top of a company have a dysfunctional relationship, there is no way that the rest of the company beneath them can be functional, Iger wrote in his autobiography, The Ride of a Lifetime. It's like having two parents who fight all the time. Now, to be fair, Bob Iger in his book was referencing the relationship that he witnessed as one of the top executives of Disney during the days of Michael Eisner and Mike Ovitz. Through a representative, former Disney CEO Bob Chapek defended his record at his time there in Disney in the top chair in a statement to CNBC. Quote, Bob Chapek is proud of the work he did in the course of his 30-year career at the Walt Disney Company, particularly during his nearly 3-year run as CEO, steering the company through the unprecedented challenges of the pandemic and setting the course for business transformation as he and his team took the disruptive yet necessary steps for business revitalization and long-term growth. Bob Iger was reached out to by CNBC, and he declined to comment for this story. Gee, I wonder why. Bob Iger finally announcing his retirement, quite frankly, came as a bit of a surprise to people like Tom Staggs and Kevin Mayer, who were there at Disney and were the two people most highly thought of, or at least were highly thought of by Bob Iger and the rest of Wall Street and Disney itself. They thought that one of those two gentlemen would wind up being the CEO of Disney. In some cases, some folks even thought they could be co-CEOs of the Walt Disney Company. But in a surprise, Bob Iger chose Bob Chapek. For more than 2 decades, Chapek earned Iger's respect as a shrewd cost cutter and a low-drama manager. Iger especially valued Chapek for his integrity and operational expertise. At each of the divisions Chapek led at Disney, home video, consumer products, parks, profit and revenue soared under his watch. Chapek also benefited from good timing, running the home video division when Disney animation hits, such as The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, and Beauty and the Beast were first sold on VHS, and piloting consumer products just as Frozen launched. Bob Chapek even cemented his reputation with Iger and the Disney board during the construction of Shanghai Disney, the $5.5 billion theme park that opened in 2016 after months of delays. And it was this success, the article says, that helped Iger move on from former Chief Operating Officer, or COO, Tom Staggs, who was then in line to take the CEO job after Iger. Staggs left the company just before Shanghai Disney finally opened. See, guys like Staggs and Mayer saw the writing on the wall, and quite honestly, one of the reasons I think Bob Iger selected Bob Chapek was not just his business acumen, but the fact that I think he felt that Bob Iger would be the least threatening successor to what Bob Iger viewed as his legacy. Mayer and Staggs were very strong personalities, more like the Bob Iger type, and Iger might have felt that they would have come in and made their own stamp on Disney that would have overshadowed his own. And if you don't believe that statement that I've made before, take it from some of these Disney executives that spoke to CNBC, who also privately speculated that Iger chose Chapek because he wouldn't rival him in either charisma or celebrity, or, more cynically, because he was unlikely to eclipse Iger's glittering record at the company. Bob Iger is a man of ego, and nothing will ever change, and nobody is going to threaten his legacy at his company. Now, here's something new, the details of which I wasn't quite familiar with before, and I find it fascinating and yet at the same time totally believable. In 2017, according to people familiar with the matter, Iger first told Chapek that he was in the running to be his potential successor. The vetting process for the chief executive officer would begin with Chapek flying across the country to meet one-on-one with board members. But Chapek never did the meetings. Bob Iger agreed to buy the majority of Fox's assets in a $71 billion deal and renewed his contract as a condition of the purchase, pushing back any talk of succession. It never ceases to amaze me the excuses that Bob Iger could find not to retire, or as in the case that we have now, come back out of it. But in January of 2020, Iger told Chapek the plan was back on. Now remember, this was very shortly before the announcement came for this, and just a couple of months before the pandemic struck. This time, Iger told him that instead of the one-on-one board interviews, Disney's lead independent director, Susan Arnold, who is also no longer there, would be in touch. Days later, Arnold delivered the news to Chapek over lunch at the Rotunda, Disney's executive dining room. She and Iger had both recommended Chapek for the job, and the board had approved. Chapek sat on the secret for 6 weeks before the public announcement. And of course, that announcement came days before the entire country, nay, the world, was locked down. By 2019, Iger was really showing his power and prowess, not only with Disney, but with Wall Street investment firms as well, who owned the largesse voting shares of Disney's stock. He had personally selected every member of the Walt Disney Company board, which is surprisingly lacking in media and entertainment experience. Iger is personally close with several of them, including Nike Executive Chairman Mark Parker and General Motors CEO Mary Barra. Mark Parker, of course, now is the chairman of the Walt Disney Company following the departure of Susan Arnold. People familiar with the matter suggest that it was from Mark Parker that Bob Iger got the idea for his succession plan. It was in October of 19 that Parker, who was then CEO of Nike, announced that he would remain as executive chairman while passing the torch to John Donahoe. Sounds familiar? Well, that's where he got it from, and that wasn't the first time. Same sort of thing happened years before, as the article goes in to describe with Michael Eisner. But of course, the biggest difference was with Michael Eisner and now Bob Iger is that Eisner did not have the support of the board, whereas this time, Iger had handpicked the entire board. Now, just days later, of course, everything was shut down, and this is where Bob Iger really turned a corner. Now he knew he couldn't leave because he couldn't leave Disney in the hands of the person that he had just picked to leave Disney in the hands of course. He had to stick around and show him the ropes and, of course, meddle in everything. Around the same time, New York Times media columnist Ben Smith published a story about the pandemic's disastrous impact on Disney. After a few weeks of letting Mr. Chapek take charge, Smith wrote, Iger had, quote, effectively returned to running the company. Iger didn't deny any of this. Quote, a crisis of this magnitude and its impact on Disney would necessarily result in my actively helping Bob and the company contend with it, particularly since I ran the company for 15 years, Iger said in an email back to Ben Smith at the New York Times. The phrase fart in church comes to mind. Bob Chapek was furious. He called Iger and told him he didn't need a savior, dropping a carefully placed expletive or two, according to people with knowledge of the call. It was the first time in more than 20 years that Chapek and Iger had a major argument. Iger would tell people no colleague had ever spoken to him like that before in his life.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I break your concentration?
That's because before that moment, probably nobody had the balls to talk to Bob Iger like that. But the problem is, maybe somebody should have 5, 10, or maybe even 15 years before this went down. But it already goes to show the absolute narcissism and arrogance of Bob Iger and what his culture brought to the Disney company. Because once again, in Bob Iger's mind, the Walt Disney Company simply cannot exist without him. Bob Chapek also complained to the Disney board about the story, demanding to be given a seat immediately. Disney had promised him one, but had not yet set a date. Chapek did not want Iger and the board talking about him or his job status while he wasn't there, according to people familiar with his thinking. 3 days after Ben Smith's story ran in the New York Times, Disney complied. Susan Arnold privately had a strongly worded conversation with Bob Iger about setting him up for success rather than undermining him, meaning Chapek, according to people familiar with the conversation. Susan Arnold also declined to comment for the story. The relationship only deteriorated from there. Iger began privately grumbling that Chapek wasn't involving him in company decisions. He told colleagues that he felt like he was on a bus that the other passengers wanted him to drive, but he couldn't reach the steering wheel. He began to understand that Bob Chapek was not going to be an obedient lieutenant, as Roy Disney and Stanley Gold had once theorized Iger himself would be as Eisner's chosen CEO. Boy, how the world comes full circle for Bob Iger, now upset that his successor wasn't behaving as he was expected to some 15 years earlier. You see where this is going? At the end of a June board meeting, and this would be ostensibly in 2020, the same year, conducted via Zoom, Disney directors asked Bob Iger, but not Bob Chapek, to stay on the call afterwards for a customary, quote, executive session. According to people familiar with the conversation, Iger told the board that his relationship with Chapek had soured and that Chapek wasn't exhibiting proper leadership qualities. The pandemic was shaking Disney to its foundations, and Iger believed that Chapek should be working more closely with the man who had run the company for the last 15 years. When Bob Chapek took over Disney, it was clear that Wall Street cared more about its streaming results than any other division of the business. And how many times have you heard me complain about this right here on this channel? Wall Street was so engrossed in the subscriber chase above all else, it ignored the value proposition until just very recently, that as soon as Disney launched Disney Plus, it was now a competitor to Netflix. And Wall Street analysts begin looking at the Walt Disney Company in the same light as Netflix. This was a stupid mistake on Wall Street's part, and I am not afraid to say that. But I will say that they have apparently since learned from their mistake, not only with Disney, but every other streaming company out there, because it's not about how many subscribers you have, it's about how much money you're making. Bob Chapek, in my words, to his credit, saw two major problems with Disney Plus's streaming operation. First, he thought there were way too many people making decisions about what content was slated for D+. Everybody apparently wanted a say at Disney about what content went where, and that included Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige and Lucasfilm and destroyer of Star Wars head Kathleen Kennedy, and the heads of Walt Disney Television and Walt Disney Studios for that matter. Mayer told Chapek the structure was messy and needed fixing. So wait a minute, hold the phone. Kevin Mayer was apparently also involved with this decision that Bob Chapek made to create the DMED division, or the Disney Media and Entertainment division, the one that he put Kareem Daniel in charge of. Kareem Daniel, Bob Chapek's top lieutenant, who was then in charge of deciding what content got produced and what content went where. And that was the thing that apparently pissed off Bob Iger and a lot of Disney studio heads above anything else. Kevin Mayer. Wow. Wonder why he's gone now, too. This next section is truly illuminating. Secondly, Bob Chapek understood the stream movies were still seen as less prestigious than those with a traditional theatrical release. The chair of Walt Disney Studios, Alan Bergman, and his direct reports were reluctant to give projected hits to Disney Plus or to Hulu. But box office returns were not driving investor sentiment. Streaming was. And during the early months of COVID, Disney had limited inventory because production on new TV series and movies had ground to a halt. Chapek wanted to put premium programming on Disney Plus as soon as possible. Chapek did not make these decisions in a vacuum to start doing Premier Access on Disney Plus. They didn't want to abandon the theatrical model. Bob Chapek did not want to abandon the theatrical model, but he was forced into a corner because these were the pressures of Wall Street at the time. Wall Street should bear as much of the blame as anybody, in my opinion, for forcing these entertainment companies down this path, because by that point, everybody should be kneeling at the altar of the almighty streaming gods and acquiring subscribers at all costs. I could spend another hour in this video tearing apart this entire article, but like I said before, we can't do it all here. But needless to say, the article goes on to clarify a lot of the inner workings that happened from the time that Bob Iger finally left in January of 2022, leaving Bob Chapek to his own machinations that, had he been left there long enough unencumbered, might have actually worked out. But of course, that was never Bob Iger's plan. Iger's plan seems like it was always sabotage and subterfuge. He was there to undermine Chapek. He was just getting out long enough to look like that, hey, I've retired. I tried to move on, but I put this person in that I deliberately meant to sack his entire career as CEO so that I could come back as the savior once again. And hopefully, everybody out there watching me do this is too stupid to understand what I'm trying to get at. Let's be honest, it wasn't 6 to 8 weeks after Bob Iger left that he deliberately went on Twitter and started the sabotage process with his tweet regarding Florida's House Bill 1557, the Parental Rights and Education Bill, after knowing that Bob Chapek was trying to steer Disney out of the political realm. Bob Iger was going to damn well make sure that Disney got dragged back in, and all of his little goons that he left behind at the Walt Disney Company were going to drag Chapek down in the mud and make sure that they screwed his pooch. And that was from the most lowly, talentless, worthless of executives and producers to the highest levels, including people like Christine McCarthy and Tom Newton, who have both since left the Walt Disney Company. Good riddance. But this is who Bob Iger is. This is what Bob Iger does. He's a snake in the grass. And the House of Mouse will never regain its former glory that we knew from years ago as long as Bob Iger is still in any way associated with this company. Nor will it have a chance provided that Bob Iger's puppet board is allowed to remain to stay where they are with his hand up their collective asses. This is a fire sale, folks. Every damn one of them needs to go. All of them. Everybody from the senior executive management level and beyond. They all need to go. But hey, that's just me. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button and do share this sucker out on the social medias. Make sure you stay tuned for the Sunday live show. We're going to be covering a lot more than what we discussed today. I promise you, stay tuned. You will not want to miss this. But until then, take care.